The direct distance from Egypt to Canaan is only about 400 kilometers. A 2-week walk would have been more than enough. But why did Moses lead 2 million people and take a full 40 years? It wasn't because they were lost, nor because the desert was too vast. This was a countdown to death that began at the Red Sea and ended in the wilderness. 2 million people escaped from the Red Sea, yet in the end, only 2 individuals walked alive into the final destination. The rest became nothing more than nameless graves on the map. If a movie were to end right as the Red Sea parted, the audience would mistake the Exodus for a triumphant blockbuster. The slaves escaped, the Pharaoh was defeated, the waters swallowed the chariots, and Moses led the Israelites toward freedom. But the Bible does not stop there. It keeps writing, and the cinematic imagery of victory begins to warp into a prolonged march of death. Thus, you realize that the Red Sea was not the grand finale. What came after the Red Sea was where the true terror began. They crossed the Red Sea, heard the thunder of Mount Sinai, and ate the manna rained down from heaven. Yet in the end, almost that entire generation who had witnessed these miracles with their own eyes died in the wilderness. They did not die at the hands of Pharaoh, nor did they perish by the shores of the Red Sea. They died on the very road to the Promised Land. Today, we are going to unfold this blood-stained map, retracing the journey from Egypt to the Red Sea, to Mount Sinai, and finally to the gates of Canaan. Every single location feels like a riddle. Where exactly was the Red Sea? Which mountain is the true Mount Sinai? And why, after finally reaching the very threshold of the Promised Land, were they driven back into the wilderness? But beneath all these mysteries lies a single, far more brutal question. Why would God rather let this entire generation die in the desert than allow them to enter the Promised Land? The Red Sea was their gateway of escape from Egypt. Mount Sinai was where they made their covenant with God. And the 40 years in the wilderness is the darkest chapter of the entire Exodus. Because out there, miracles failed to transform them into new people. The Red Sea had parted, the Egyptian army was destroyed, yet in their hearts they longed to return to Egypt time and time again. Therefore, the first stop on this map must bring us back to Egypt. Only by seeing clearly what they endured there can we understand why these 40 years came to pass. When most people think of Egypt, they think of pyramids, the Nile, pharaohs, temples, and gold. But at the beginning of Exodus, the lens is not focused on Egypt's splendor. To the Israelites, Egypt was a massive prison. The Israelites were not originally slaves. Long before, Jacob's family came to Egypt because of a famine. At that time, Joseph was still in power. He saved his own clan, and he saved Egypt. But as time passed, the generation that knew Joseph died, and a new Pharaoh arose. Seeing that the Israelites were multiplying rapidly, fear grew in his heart. He no longer viewed them as a family of sojourners, but as a foreign population that could pose a threat to Egypt. And so, the oppression began. The Israelites were forced into hard labor, mixing mud, gathering straw, and baking bricks under the scorching sun to build the store cities of Egypt. Taskmasters stood over them, driving them ruthlessly. A specific quota of bricks had to be met every day, and falling short by even one could mean a beating. They woke up in the morning knowing that what awaited them were still the mud pits, the brick kilns, and the whips. They returned home at night, never knowing if their children would still be alive the next day. For Pharaoh later issued an even more cruel decree. Every boy born to a Hebrew woman was to be cast into the river. The intent behind this command was crystal clear. Once grown, these boys would become the strength of their nation, so Egypt wanted to erase them from the future while they were still unable to speak. A mother would carry a child for 10 months, but after the birth, what she heard was not blessings, but the sound of approaching footsteps. She had to stifle her baby's cries, avoid the eyes of her neighbors, and guard against the searches of the Egyptian soldiers. It was during those very days that a baby boy was born. Seeing that he was a beautiful child, his mother hid him for 3 months. But as the infant grew day by day, his cries became harder and harder to hide. So she made a basket out of papyrus reeds, coated it with tar and pitch, placed the child inside, and laid it among the reeds by the bank of the Nile. This was not a clever plan conjured up by a mother. It was the absolute last thing she could do when she had run out of options. The child's sister stood at a distance, watching to see where this tiny basket would drift. If you zoom in on the map right down to the bank of the Nile, the image is tiny. A basket, a patch of reeds, and a crying baby. Yet it was precisely here that the route of the Exodus began to turn. Pharaoh's daughter came down to the river to bathe, noticed the basket, and when she opened it, she saw the baby crying. She knew he was one of the Hebrew children, yet she felt compassion for him. This infant, who by all rights should have died under Pharaoh's decree, was instead brought right into Pharaoh's palace. He was later named Moses, a name connected to being drawn out of the water. The child survived. Moses grew up in the palace. He was educated in all the wisdom of the Egyptians and witnessed the sheer power of Pharaoh, but he was not an Egyptian. He knew in his heart that he belonged to the same nation as those suffering in the brick kilns. This identity was bound to force a choice upon him sooner or later. One day, Moses went out and saw an Egyptian beating a Hebrew. It was not the suffering of a stranger. It was his own brother being beaten. Moses looked this way and that, and seeing no one, he killed the Egyptian and hid his body in the sand. The next day, he went out again and saw two Hebrews fighting. He tried to reconcile them, but one of them retorted, "Who made you a ruler and a judge over us? Do you mean to kill me as you killed the Egyptian?" Moses was instantly terrified, realizing that what he had done was known. When Pharaoh heard of it, he sought to kill him, so Moses fled from Egypt and went to live in Midian. If you continue to look at the map, Moses was not leading a nation out of Egypt this time. He was escaping Egypt all by himself. He walked from the Nile basin toward the edge of the wilderness, and the Hebrew of the royal palace became a shepherd in the land of Midian. There, he married, had children, and lived a life far removed from Egypt. Many years passed, and the slaves in Egypt were still crying out. The Bible says that God heard their groaning and remembered his covenant with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Then God appeared before Moses, not in a palace, not on a battlefield, but in the wilderness, from within a bush that was burning but not consumed. As Moses drew near, God called his name, and Moses said, "Here I am." God told him, "I have surely seen the affliction of my people who are in Egypt, and have heard their cry because of their taskmasters. I have come down to deliver them out of the hand of the Egyptians." Then God said, "Come now therefore, and I will send you to Pharaoh that you may bring my people, the children of Israel, out of Egypt." Moses did not agree right away. He said, "Who am I that I should go to Pharaoh? If they ask me, 'What is his name?' what shall I say to them? What if they do not believe me? I am slow of speech and slow of tongue." Piece by piece, Moses spoke out his fears. It wasn't that he didn't know where Egypt was. He knew it all too well. His past was there, and so was his failure. He had once tried to save a single man with his own hands, and it ended with him running for his life. Now, God was asking him to go back and face an entire empire. In the end, Moses returned to Egypt with Aaron. He stood before Pharaoh and spoke those history-altering words, "Thus says the Lord, the God of Israel, let my people go." Pharaoh's reply was utterly cold. "Who is the Lord, that I should obey his voice and let Israel go? I do not know the Lord, and moreover, I will not let Israel go." At this point, the Israelites had not yet departed. They were still in Egypt, still in Pharaoh's grasp. But God had already begun to force Pharaoh to let go. He would first strike everything the Egyptians relied upon. Only when this empire cracked from within would the slaves truly set foot on the path of departure. And the way God dismantled Egypt was not through an ordinary war, but plague after plague, each one telling Pharaoh that these people were not his property. The 10 plagues did not fall all at once. They descended upon Egypt layer by layer. Every time, Pharaoh had an opportunity to loosen his grip, and every time he clenched his fist once more. First, Moses lifted his staff and struck the Nile. The water turned into blood, the fish died, the river stank, and the Egyptians could not drink its water. To Egypt, the Nile was no ordinary river. It irrigated the land, brought food, sustained cities, and anchored Pharaoh's glory. When this river of life turned into a river of death, the Egyptians saw for the first time that the very thing they relied on most could turn around and harm them. Next came the frogs. They entered the palaces, the bedrooms, the beds, and even the ovens. Pharaoh begged Moses to pray, but once the plague stopped, his heart hardened again. Then came the gnats, and then the flies. People's bodies found no peace, and the houses and the land were ruined. Egypt still seemed to have its palaces and armies, but daily life had begun to spiral out of control. Next, a severe plague struck the livestock, and the horses, donkeys, camels, herds, and flocks in the fields suffered. Then came the boils. Dust was thrown into the air, falling on both man and beast, breaking out into festering boils. The disaster was no longer confined to the river or the fields. It had reached human skin. Later, hail fell with thunder and flashing fire. The hail struck the fields, battering both man and beast, destroying the crops and shattering the trees. Those who ignored the warning and remained in the fields perished in the storm. Pharaoh once again admitted he had sinned, but the moment the storm ceased, he went back on his word yet again. After that came the locusts. They swarmed like an army, covering the surface of the land until it was black, devouring every plant left behind by the hail. Egypt's remaining food and hope were chewed away to nothing. Then darkness descended. This was no ordinary night. For 3 days people could not see one another, nor did anyone dare leave their place. Egypt took pride in the sun, and Pharaoh's power was deeply intertwined with its solar brilliance. But for those few days, Egypt's light vanished. Only where the Israelites lived was there light. The Israelites had not yet left Egypt, but the life of the Egyptians had been dismantled piece by piece. They could not drink clean river water, their crops were ruined, their livestock had collapsed, and daytime had turned into night. When the final plague arrived, the calamity no longer stopped at the river, the soil, or the beasts. This time, the disaster entered every single home. The firstborn son of every Egyptian family was to die, from the firstborn of Pharaoh sitting on his throne, to the firstborn of the lowest prisoner, and even the firstborn of all the livestock. None could escape this night. After this night, the Israelites would finally leave. But the mark of their departure was not swords, nor an uprising, nor an army. It was the blood on their doors. Before they truly set out on their journey, God wanted them to remember one thing. They were able to walk out alive not because they had broken through Egypt by their own strength, but because death had passed over their doors. But before they could leave Egypt, there was one more night that had to pass, a night that would decide who would make it out alive. Before the final plague struck, God commanded the Israelites to prepare a lamb. The lamb had to be without blemish. They were to slaughter it at twilight and apply its blood to the doorposts and the lintels of their houses. That night they were to eat the meat of the lamb, along with unleavened bread and bitter herbs. As they ate, they were to have their cloaks tucked into their belts, their sandals on their feet, and their staffs in their hands. They were not sitting down to enjoy a leisurely meal. They were waiting to depart. Outside, the stillness of Egypt's final night had not yet been broken. Inside, families gathered around the lamb, listening to the distant sound of the wind. The children might not have known what was about to happen, but the adults knew. This was the night before leaving Egypt, and it was also the night death would walk across this land. God said, "When I see the blood, I will pass over you, and the plague shall not be on you to destroy you when I strike the land of Egypt." At midnight, a great cry rang out from every corner of Egypt. There was wailing in Pharaoh's palace, crying in the homes of the servants, and not a single household was without someone dead. This empire, which had once thrown Hebrew baby boys into the river, was now tasting the agonizing pain of loss in the deaths of its own firstborn. During the night, Pharaoh summoned Moses and Aaron and said, "Rise up, get out from among my people, both you and the children of Israel, and go, serve the Lord as you have said." The Egyptians also urged the people to hurry and leave the land, for they said, "We will all be dead if this goes on." So the Israelites took their dough before it was leavened, carrying their belongings wrapped in clothes upon their shoulders, and departed from Egypt. If you only look at the map, you will simply see a crowd setting out from Egypt and moving forward. But the Bible first draws our attention to another sign, the blood on the doors, because the Israelites did not escape by fighting their way out. Before leaving Egypt, they were preserved under the token of blood. The Passover thus became a day they were commanded to remember, to tell their children generation after generation, "We were once slaves in Egypt, but the Lord brought us out with a mighty hand." They set off, but as soon as the procession left Egypt, the route began to turn strange. The next scene was not a shortcut toward Canaan, but a dead end by the sea. After the Israelites left Egypt, God did not lead them along the nearest road through the land of the Philistines. The Bible says that although that road was shorter, God did not take them that way, because he knew that if they faced war, they might change their minds and return to Egypt. So he rerouted them toward the wilderness. By day, a pillar of cloud went ahead to guide them, and by night, a pillar of fire illuminated their path. This nation, newly emerged from bondage, walked into an unfamiliar and desolate terrain, carrying their elderly children, livestock, and belongings. Just then, Pharaoh changed his mind yet again. He and his officials said, "What have we done in letting Israel go from serving us?" So Pharaoh made his chariot ready and took his army with him. The Egyptian chariots were terrifying on ancient battlefields. To a crowd of slaves who had just left the brick kilns, this would not be a battle, but a slaughter. They would be overtaken, scattered, and dragged back. The Israelites looked up and saw the Egyptians marching after them. Before them was the sea, behind them were the chariots. The wilderness had no walls, and the seashore offered no retreat. They were instantly terrified and cried out to Moses, "Was it because there were no graves in Egypt that you brought us to die in the wilderness? Didn't we say to you in Egypt, 'Leave us alone, let us serve the Egyptians'? It would have been better for us to serve the Egyptians than to die in the wilderness." They had barely left Egypt, yet they were already looking at Egypt as their safety net. Moses said to the people, "Do not be afraid. Stand firm, and you will see the deliverance the Lord will bring you today." Then the Lord told Moses to lift up his staff and stretch out his hand over the sea. All that night, the Lord drove the sea back with a strong east wind, and the waters were divided, forming a wall on their right and on their left, turning the sea into dry land. The Israelites walked right through, the elderly holding the children, driving their livestock forward, the entire nation passing through the midst of the sea. The Egyptian chariots pursued them in. During the morning watch, the Lord threw the Egyptian army into confusion, twisting their chariot wheels so that they could barely move. The Egyptians cried out, "Let us flee from the Israelites, for the Lord is fighting for them against Egypt." Moses stretched out his hand over the sea again, and the waters returned to their normal depth. The chariots, the horsemen, and the entire army of Pharaoh were completely swallowed by the sea. At daybreak, the Israelites stood on the shore, looking at the corpses of the Egyptians washed up on the beach. The empire that had pursued them was now barred forever on the other side of the sea. If the story stopped at this very scene, it would be perfectly complete. The slaves escaped, the Pharaoh failed, and the waters closed back up. But once the Red Sea parted, another question remained. To this day, there is still no universally accepted answer regarding the exact location of the Red Sea. The Red Sea we see on modern maps is that long, narrow body of water to the east of Egypt. But when you piece together the biblical place names, ancient translations, the wilderness itinerary, and the location of Mount Sinai, it becomes far from simple. Therefore, There are three common theories regarding the body of water that Moses led the Israelites to cross. The first is the Sea of Reeds, also known as the Northern Route. This theory suggests that what they crossed might not be the deep, wide ocean that many people imagine today, but rather the lakes, marshes, or shallow water areas near Suez, east of the Nile Delta. Proponents of this view often point out that the original biblical name for the sea is related to the Sea of Reeds. If interpreted this way, the Israelites' route would have been further north and much closer to the Egyptian border. This theory explains one question: why were they able to reach the water's edge so shortly after leaving Egypt? However, it also leaves a major doubt. If it was merely shallow water or wetlands, how are we to understand the biblical imagery of the waters being a wall to them on their right hand and on their left? The second is the traditional Sinai Peninsula route. This theory suggests that the Israelites crossed the sea near the Gulf of Suez, entered the Sinai Peninsula, and ultimately arrived at the traditional Mount Sinai located in the southern part of the peninsula. Many biblical maps, cinematic depictions, and church traditions closely align with this route. Its main advantage is familiarity. The Red Sea, the wilderness, and Mount Sinai all seem to fit into a relatively cohesive itinerary. Yet, the problem is that many of the encampments mentioned in the book of Exodus are highly difficult to pinpoint or correlate with modern geography today. Some locations can only be conjectured, some names have changed over time, and some positions remain entirely uncertain to this day. The third is the Gulf of Aqaba route. This is a bolder theory, suggesting that after leaving Egypt, the Israelites traveled much farther than the traditional route, marching continuously in a southeasterly direction until they finally crossed the sea at the Gulf of Aqaba, with Nuweiba Beach being the most frequently cited location. Proponents of this route often point to several highly intriguing clues. Some claim that remnants resembling chariot wheels have been discovered on the seabed, while others note that on the opposite Saudi Arabian shore there are blackened mountaintops, suspected ancient altars, and ruins potentially linked to the Israelite encampments. If these clues are indeed valid, the route of the Exodus would no longer be confined to ancient texts. It might have actually left physical traces on modern maps. The problem, however, is that these claims remain highly controversial to this day. Some discoveries lack reliable archaeological validation, and certain photographs and locations are open to alternative interpretations. Therefore, the very aspect that makes the Gulf of Aqaba route so captivating is precisely what makes it the most fiercely debated. It provides a powerful sense of presence, as if the Red Sea, the chariots, and Mount Sinai could all be rediscovered. Yet it cannot be treated as a settled conclusion. This is what makes the mystery of the Red Sea truly perplexing. Every proposed route explains a portion of the puzzle, yet each leaves behind new questions. The northern route resolves the issue of distance but diminishes the dramatic sea-crossing imagery held in many people's minds. The traditional route is the most familiar but makes it difficult to pinpoint every encampment. The Gulf of Aqaba route is the most breathtaking but faces the greatest amount of controversy. Furthermore, the location of the Red Sea is not an isolated issue. If the crossing site changes, then Mount Sinai, where they later journeyed, might not be the same mountain either. But before reaching Mount Sinai, they first entered the wilderness. As soon as they set foot in the desert, the grumbling began. Behind them was the Red Sea that had just closed. Before them was a boundless desert, with no cities, no fields, and no reliable source of water. Having just finished singing their song of victory, the Israelites quickly ran into their first problem: water. This time the grumbling was not about idolatry, nor was it out of fear for the future. It was simply that their bodies could no longer hold out. They marched for 3 days in the wilderness, but found no water. Later they arrived at Marah, where there was finally water, but it was bitter and undrinkable. The people immediately murmured against Moses, saying, "What shall we drink?" Moses cried out to the Lord, and the Lord showed him a tree. He threw the tree into the water, and the water became sweet. Right after that, they came to Elim, where there were 12 springs of water and 70 palm trees. On the map of the wilderness, Elim feels like a brief pause, a source of water, a patch of shade, a moment to breathe. But they could not stay there forever. They moved onward and came to the wilderness of Sin, and this time the problem became food. The people grumbled again, saying, "Would that we had died by the hand of the Lord in the land of Egypt, when we sat by the meat pots and ate bread to the full. For you have brought us out into this wilderness to kill this whole assembly with hunger." There is a very specific shift in these words. Egypt was clearly the place that enslaved them, where they were mistreated, beaten, and their baby boys were killed. Yet when there was no food in the wilderness, what they remembered was not the whips, but the meat pots. When people are terrified, memory tends to warp toward whatever part allows them to survive. Even if a place once caused them immense harm, they will rationalize it as, at least there was food to eat. God did not destroy them on the spot. Instead, He rained down manna. Every morning a fine, flake-like thing lay on the ground, like frost on the earth. When the people saw it, they did not know what it was, and asked one another, "What is it?" The name manna is precisely connected to this question. They gathered it every morning, each according to their need. He who gathered much had nothing left over, and he who gathered little had no lack. On the 6th day, they gathered twice as much, and on the 7th day, they rested. This was not just about providing food. It was about making them relearn a lesson every single morning. That staying alive today does not depend on Pharaoh's granaries, but on God's provision. Later, they found no water again at Rephidim, and the people contended with Moses, saying, "Give us water to drink." They even questioned, "Is the Lord among us or not?" God commanded Moses to strike the rock, and water flowed out from it. Yet no sooner had the water crisis been solved than a new danger arrived. The Amalekites came and attacked Israel, and Joshua led the men out to battle. Moses stood on top of the hill with his hands raised. Whenever Moses held up his hand, Israel prevailed. But whenever he lowered his hand, Amalek prevailed. Eventually, Aaron and Hur held up Moses' hands, one on each side, until sunset, and only then did the Israelites win the battle. This was the wilderness after the Red Sea. They did not have a peaceful journey toward Mount Sinai. They were starved of water, starved of food, grumbling the entire way, and constantly encountering enemies. God gave them water, gave them manna, and helped them in battle. Yet every time they faced hardship, their immediate reflex was still fear, still grumbling, and still longing for Egypt. It was not until 3 months later that they finally arrived at Mount Sinai. This time, God was not just going to give them water and food. He was going to give them a brand new identity at the foot of this mountain. 3 months after the Exodus, the Israelites came into the wilderness of Sinai and camped there before the mountain. The Red Sea had allowed them to leave Egypt, but Mount Sinai was to answer another question. Who were these escaped slaves to become next? Here, they were no longer just fugitives. They were to become a people in a covenant with God. God called Moses up the mountain and said to him, "Thus you shall say to the house of Jacob and tell the children of Israel, you have seen what I did to the Egyptians and how I bore you on eagle's wings and brought you to myself." Then God said, "Now therefore, if you will indeed obey my voice and keep my covenant, then you shall be a special treasure to me above all people." The Israelites answered together, "All that the Lord has spoken, we will do." 3 days later, there were thunders and lightnings on the mountain, and a thick cloud, and the sound of the trumpet was exceedingly loud, so that all the people who were in the camp trembled. Moses brought the people out of the camp to meet with God, and they stood at the foot of the mountain. Now Mount Sinai was completely in smoke, because the Lord descended upon it in fire. Its smoke ascended like the smoke of a furnace, and the whole mountain quaked greatly. As the sound of the trumpet blew longer and became louder and louder, Moses spoke, and God answered him by voice. This was no ordinary gathering. This was a crowd newly emerged from bondage, standing before God for the very first time, hearing how they were supposed to live. God gave them the 10 Commandments. You shall have no other gods before me. You shall not make for yourself a carved image. You shall not take the name of the Lord your God in vain. Remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. Honor your father and your mother. You shall not murder. You shall not commit adultery. You shall not steal. You shall not bear false witness. You shall not covet. In Egypt, their time belonged to Pharaoh. Their bodies belonged to the construction sites, and their children did not even fully belong to them. But at the foot of Mount Sinai, God gave them the law and a brand new identity. The Red Sea allowed them to leave Egypt. Mount Sinai told them how to live after leaving. But where exactly is the real Mount Sinai? To this day, people still debate. The most familiar theory points to the traditional Mount Sinai in the southern part of the Sinai Peninsula, which features an ancient monastery and a long history of pilgrimage. Many biblical maps, cinematic depictions, and illustrations place the site where Moses received the 10 Commandments right there. For many, this mountain has become synonymous with the book of Exodus. The problem, however, is that tradition does not mean all questions have been answered. If the location of the Red Sea is still disputed, then the location of Mount Sinai will naturally be re-examined as well. Thus, another theory emerged. Some believe that the true Mount Sinai might not be in the southern Sinai Peninsula at all, but rather in northwestern Saudi Arabia. The most frequently cited name in this theory is Jabal al-Lawz. This perspective is usually tied to the Gulf of Aqaba crossing route. That is to say, if the Israelites crossed the sea around the Gulf of Aqaba, then the place they reached after crossing would likely be on the Arabian side. There, some point to a blackened mountaintop, a suspected ancient altar, rock carvings, remnants of campsites, and various locations that seem to align with the biblical narrative. If these clues are indeed valid, then Mount Sinai is no longer just a traditional site. It might truly be hidden along another, overlooked route. Yet, these claims are equally controversial. Some sites might simply be natural geological formations. The age and purpose of some ruins have no reliable conclusions. And while some photographs look striking, photographs alone cannot prove an entire route. Therefore, the question of Mount Sinai is just like that of the Red Sea. It is fascinating because it seems to pull an ancient story back onto a real-world map. It is perilous precisely because many clues are far from settled. The traditional Mount Sinai holds historical memory, while Jabal al-Lawz offers a powerful sense of presence, and other candidate sites have their own explanations. If it were up to you, would you lean toward the traditional Sinai Peninsula route or the more subversive Saudi route? Feel free to leave your thoughts in the comments section. Yet the Bible does not give us a coordinate that we can plug into a GPS today. What it tells us instead is that a crowd of slaves freshly emerged from Egypt once stood at the foot of a mountain. They heard the thunder, saw the thick cloud, and listened to the law given to them by God. At the base of that mountain, they declared, "All that the Lord has spoken, we will do." But no sooner had they spoken those words than they did something completely the opposite. Moses went up the mountain to receive God's commands, while the people waited below. One day passed, then two, and the time dragged on longer and longer. They could not see Moses, nor did they know if he would ever come back down. Waiting mutated into anxiety, and anxiety swiftly turned into action. This time, it wasn't that their bodies were giving out. It was that they could no longer see Moses, as if they had lost the only spiritual anchor they could hold on to. The people gathered around Aaron and said, "Come, make us gods that shall go before us. As for this Moses, the man who brought us up out of the land of Egypt, we do not know what has become of him." They wanted a God they could see, a God they could touch, a God they could put right out in front of them. Aaron told them to take off their golden earrings. He collected the gold and fashioned it into a golden calf. The people cried out, "This is your God, O Israel, that brought you out of the land of Egypt." The next day they offered sacrifices, sat down to eat and drink, and rose up to revel. The very people who had just heard, "You shall not make for yourself a carved image," amidst the thunder and fire, were now bowing down to a golden calf at the base of the mountain. It wasn't that they had entirely forgotten God. Rather, they re-engineered God into a shape they were familiar with. In Egypt, the image of the bull was deeply intertwined with power, a bountiful harvest, and the worship of pagan gods. The Israelites had left Egypt physically, but they carried their Egyptian imagination with them. They wanted to manage their present anxiety using the familiar methods of their past. If you look at the map at this exact moment, you will see that they are already far away from Egypt. Yet through this scene of the golden calf, it becomes clear that Egypt was still tracking right along with them. At the foot of Mount Sinai, God told Moses that the people below had corrupted themselves. When Moses came down the mountain, holding the 2 tablets of the testimony in his hands, he heard the shouting in the camp and saw the calf and the dancing. His anger burned, and he smashed the tablets at the foot of the mountain. The covenant they had just established was shattered by their own betrayal. Moses took the calf they had made, burned it in the fire, ground it to powder, scattered it on the water, and made the Israelites drink it. Judgment also fell upon the camp. The golden calf was not a minor, easily overlooked footnote in history. It exposes a profound truth. The issue with the Israelites was never just a lack of water and food. In moments of terror, they would readily swap God for something they could control. The Red Sea could block Pharaoh's chariots, but it could not block the human heart from bringing back the idols of the past. However, the golden calf was not yet the ultimate turning point. The event that truly rewrote their itinerary took place right at the threshold of the Promised Land. The Israelites continued their journey from Sinai and arrived at Kadesh Barnea, which was already near the border of Canaan. If you were to trace the Exodus route on a map, this should have been a thrilling location. Egypt was behind them, the Red Sea was behind them, Mount Sinai was also behind them, and right ahead was the land God had promised them. The Lord commanded Moses to send men to spy out the land. 12 spies were chosen, 1 from each tribe. They entered Canaan and saw its cities, the land, the inhabitants, and the fruit. When they reached the valley of Eshcol, they cut down a cluster of grapes and carried it back on a pole between 2 of them. That land was indeed flowing with milk and honey. God's promise was no empty word. But the spies also saw high walls and powerful inhabitants. After 40 days, they returned to give their report. They began by saying that the land did flow with milk and honey, but then added, "Nevertheless, the people who dwell in the land are strong. The cities are fortified and very large. Moreover, we saw the descendants of Anak, the giants there." Caleb quieted the people and said, "Let us go up at once and take possession of it, for we are well able to overcome it." But the other spies replied, "We are not able to go up against the people, for they are stronger than we." They also said, "All the people whom we saw in it are men of great stature. We saw ourselves as grasshoppers, and so we must have appeared to them." Before the battle had even begun, they had already shrunk themselves in their own minds. What erupted this time was not hunger or a lack of water, but a paralyzing fear of the future. Standing at the gateway to the Promised Land, they could see nothing but fortified walls and giants. That night, all the congregation lifted up their voices and cried, and the people wept. They grumbled against Moses and Aaron, saying, "Would that we had died in the land of Egypt, or would that we had died in this wilderness." They even said, "Let us select a leader and return to Egypt." After journeying all the way to the threshold of the Promised Land, their cry was still to return to Egypt. Moses and Aaron fell on their faces, while Joshua and Caleb tore their clothes and pleaded with the congregation not to rebel against the Lord or fear the people of the land. But the people refused to listen. They even talked of stoning Joshua and Caleb to death. Just then, the glory of the Lord appeared at the tabernacle. The Lord declared that this generation would never enter the Promised Land. their carcasses would fall in the wilderness. Since they had spied out the land for 40 days, they would bear their guilt for 40 years, a year for each day. Their children would eventually enter, but this generation would not. This was the greatest turning point of the Exodus route. They did not wander for 40 years because they didn't know the way. They had already reached the door, they had seen the fruit and heard the promise, yet they believed in fortified walls and giants more than they believed in the God who had brought them this far. From that moment on, their route no longer moved forward. For the next 40 years, only one thing remained: waiting for that generation to fall. The 40 years in the wilderness cannot be dismissed as merely an empty stretch of the journey. It was not a period of time that the Bible carelessly skipped over. It was the final destination of an entire generation. If you only draw a navigation line on a map, it looks simple enough. But what is truly terrifying is the reality of the individuals who vanished one by one behind that line. Korah, Dathan, and Abiram gathered together to oppose Moses and Aaron, saying, "You take too much upon yourselves, for all the congregation is holy, every one of them, and the Lord is among them. Why then do you exalt yourselves above the assembly of the Lord?" These words might have sounded like a plea for fairness, but what they were actually challenging was the leadership established by God. When Moses heard it, he fell on his face. In the end, the earth opened its mouth and swallowed up Korah's faction and all that belonged to them, and fire came out from the Lord and consumed those who offered incense. This rebellion showed the people that the problems in the wilderness were never just about a lack of food and water. Deep within the human heart, there was also a craving for power, resentment, and defiance. Later on, the people became discouraged because of the hardships of the way. They spoke against God and against Moses, saying, "Why have you brought us up out of Egypt to die in the wilderness? For there is no food and no water, and our soul loathes this worthless bread." The worthless bread they spoke of was the manna provided by God. Having grown accustomed to this daily provision, they began to despise it. Therefore, the Lord sent fiery serpents among the people, and they bit the people so that many of Israel died. The people came to Moses and said, "We have sinned, for we have spoken against the Lord and against you." God commanded Moses to make a bronze serpent and set it on a pole, and it came to pass that if a serpent had bitten anyone, when he looked at the bronze serpent, he lived. This would become an imagery referenced again later in the Bible, but at that moment it unfolded amidst a landscape of death and repentance. As time marched on, Miriam died, and Aaron died. One name after another vanished from the ranks. While the older generation collapsed in the wilderness, a new generation grew up in the desert. To these young people, Egypt was not a first-hand experience of bondage, but rather a past repeatedly recounted by their parents. What they witnessed every single day were the pillar of cloud, the pillar of fire, the tabernacle, the manna, and the slow, steady departure of an entire generation. These 40 years were like a prolonged purging. God did not make them wander in the desert because the geography was too complex. He was allowing that unfaithful generation to fade out of history. If that generation had been permitted to enter Canaan, carrying their Egyptian fears and complaints, they would have likely turned the new land into the same old bondage. Thus, the wilderness was not a blank space on the map. The wilderness was a path of judgment for a generation. They had witnessed the greatest number of miracles, yet they became the most tragic generation of all. But the story does not end here, because in the end, not even Moses himself was able to enter that land toward which he had led the people. The final image on the map is not the gates of Canaan, but a mountain, Mount Nebo. Even Moses was left standing outside the door. The people came into the wilderness of Zin and stayed at Kadesh, and Miriam died there. Soon there was no water for the congregation, so they gathered together against Moses and Aaron. They contended with Moses and said, "Would that we had died when our brethren died before the Lord. Why have you brought up the assembly of the Lord into this wilderness, that we and our animals should die here?" Moses had heard this voice far too many times. From the shores of the Red Sea, to Mara, to the wilderness of Sin, to Rephidim, and now here. 40 years had passed. The complaints had changed locations, but the content remained almost exactly the same. This time it wasn't just the people who were exhausted. Moses was exhausted too. This was not the first time he had heard these words, nor was it the first time he had been pushed to the brink of a breakdown by this crowd. Moses and Aaron went from the presence of the assembly to the door of the tabernacle and fell on their faces. The Lord spoke to Moses, saying, "Take the staff, and you and your brother Aaron gather the assembly together. Speak to the rock before their eyes, and it will yield its water." God explicitly said to speak to the rock, but after Moses gathered the assembly, he said to them, "Hear now, you rebels, must we bring water for you out of this rock?" Then he lifted his hand and struck the rock twice with his staff. Water gushed out, and the congregation and their livestock drank. On the surface, the problem was solved. The people had water to drink. But the Lord said to Moses and Aaron, "Because you did not believe me, to hallow me in the eyes of the children of Israel, therefore you shall not bring this assembly into the land which I have given them." This scene is difficult for many people to accept. Moses had led the people for 40 years. He had stood face to face with Pharaoh, endured the 10 plagues, raised his staff to part the sea, received the law on the mountain, and interceded for the people time and time again. Yet, in the end, he could not enter Canaan. If we look at it purely from a human emotional perspective, Moses had endured too much. He had tolerated grumbling, attacks, betrayal, and unfaithfulness, spending almost his entire life on this crowd. But the Bible does not take the responsibility of leadership lightly. Moses represented God in the eyes of the people. When God commanded him to speak, he instead struck the rock in anger and proclaimed, "Must we bring water for you out of this rock?" This was more than just a loss of emotional control. He failed to show the people God's holiness as commanded. As a leader, he carried the reflection of God's authority, and in such a pivotal moment, even an emotional outburst could not be overlooked as a trivial matter. Later, the Israelites arrived east of the Jordan River, and the new generation was prepared to enter the promised land. Knowing that he could not cross over, Moses exhorted the people one last time, reviewing the journey they had traveled and reminding them never to forget God. Then Moses climbed Mount Nebo. The Lord showed him the whole land, from Gilead to Dan, all of Naphtali, the territory of Ephraim and Manasseh, all the land of Judah as far as the western sea, the Negev and the whole region from the valley of Jericho, the city of palms. He saw it with his eyes, but he could not cross over into it. This imagery is far quieter than that of the Red Sea. By the shores of the Red Sea, Moses lifted his staff, the waters parted, and the entire nation marched forward. On Mount Nebo, Moses stood gazing into the distance, his footsteps frozen in place. He had led a nation for 40 years, only to find himself looking at a place he was barred from entering. So Moses died there in the land of Moab. The Bible says he was 120 years old when he died, yet his eyes were not weak nor his vitality gone. He did not depart in a state of confusion. He saw the land with absolute clarity, and he knew with absolute certainty that he would never step foot inside. Joshua took over the mission, and the Israelites were about to cross the Jordan River, but Moses' journey ended at Mount Nebo. The answer to the final question of the Exodus is revealed right here. Let us unfold this map once more. Egypt was where they were enslaved. The Red Sea was where they were saved. Mount Sinai was where they made their covenant. Kadesh Barnea was where they shrank back. The wilderness was where that generation slowly collapsed. Mount Nebo was where Moses saw the promise but could not enter. This route may look like a physical trek across the earth, but what the Bible truly records is the layer-by-layer exposure of the human heart. In Egypt, they feared Pharaoh. At the Red Sea, they feared death. In the wilderness, they feared running out of water and food. At Mount Sinai, they feared losing sight of Moses and thus built the golden calf. And at the threshold of the Promised Land, they feared giants and chose to return to Egypt instead. 40 years passed, and they walked countless miles, but the hardest stretch was never the distance between Egypt and Canaan. The hardest journey was traveling from a slave's mentality to a heart of complete trust in God. Therefore, the most brutal aspect of the Exodus was not how many people died in the wilderness. It was the fact that, although they had physically left Egypt, they proved time and time again that their hearts had never truly escaped. When people choose to believe only in fear, only in the past, and only in the dangers right in front of their eyes, then even the greatest of miracles cannot automatically make them free. This is precisely why that generation could not enter the Promised Land. This map has finally reached its end, but the question left behind by the Bible is far from over. If a person has already left Egypt, yet continues to live like a slave, if a person has already witnessed miracles, yet still retreats into terror at every hardship, if a person is already standing at the very gates of the Promised Land, yet still refuses to move forward, is that person truly free? It took only a single night for the Israelites to leave Egypt, but it took God a full 40 years to get Egypt out of their hearts.